Hello and welcome to Papers Past. This is the channel where we rummage through old newspapers to witness history as it really happened. Okay, today I'm looking at the Leicester Journal and Midland County's General Advertiser, dated 21st July 1826. And this is an ad that popped out at me. It says, Negro Slavery. The ladies of Leicester and its vicinity, who are anxious for the abolition of British colonial slavery, are earnestly requested to meet at the Female Asylum in the Newark on Tuesday next 15th instant at 11 o'clock for the purpose of forming a ladies' society similar to those already established in various parts of the kingdom. The good ladies of Leicester represented a growing sector of the British public who, appalled at the treatment of slaves in the colonies, were determined to do something about it. This movement, set up in 1823, was known as the Anti-Slavery Society. Led by William Wilberforce and others, the anti-slavery or abolitionist movement had already had some success. In 1807, slave trading had been made illegal in Britain and its colonies. However, this had not stopped other countries carrying on the trade, and slaves were still not free. For the slaves of the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, life carried on as normal. Badly. The continued barbaric treatment of slaves in the colonies was being widely reported, and the British public were becoming more and more horrified. Not that the abolitionists were getting it all their own way. There was, unsurprisingly, a lot of resistance from big business, who had vested interests in the plantation sector and the vast amounts of money being made. This political cartoon of the period pokes fun at the abolitionists and tries to give a vision of what life might be like if slaves were free. Note the caricature of Wilberforce as master of ceremonies on the left. But the newspapers of the time were featuring more and more disturbing reports of slave abuse, and the tide was turning. Listen to the two shocking accounts of slave trading that I found in this one newspaper alone. Slave dealing. Mr. Thomas Young, late captain of the merchant ship Malta of Liverpool, employed in the African trade, has undergone an examination at Deptford and is now in the House of Correction, Coldbath Fields, under Sir Richard Burney's warrant of commitment, on a charge of having sold for slaves 4 girls, natives of a part of the coast of Africa near St. John's Island, who had been placed with him as hostages or security for the performance of certain contracts entered into between him and 2 of the native chiefs. The witnesses against the accused were the mate and some of the crew of the Malta, and from their statements the following facts appeared. It is well known that it is the practice in trading with the Africans to barter goods of European manufacture for gold dust and the other merchandise which their country produces. But such is the feeling of distrust which the natives entertain of Europeans, that they seldom or never bring their goods on board of a ship, until they have first got securely on shore the commodities which they are to purchase, so that it becomes necessary that the captain, for his own security, should have some pledge for the fulfilment of the contract on the part of the African, or it is more than probable that he would never see either his goods or his customer again. The security almost uniformly given is the leaving on board the European vessel as hostages some of the members of the African's family, amongst whom are generally some of his numerous wives. When the Malta, on her last voyage, was lying on that part of the coast near to the island of St. John, Captain Young bartered, amongst others, with a chief called Antonio Joe, who possessed himself of a great quantity of beads, knives, bars of iron, and other things equally valuable, for which he was to send on board by a certain day a quantity of gold dust, ivory, and palm oil, and by way of security he left 4 of his wives, the eldest of whom was about 16 years of age, and the youngest not more than 13. In the regular course of time, Antonio Joe performed his contract, and demanded his wives, but Captain Young refused at that time to give them up, alleging that another chief with whom he had dealt had not performed his contract. This matter was proceeding some days, during which, so witnesses swear, Captain Young made each of the chief's wives, in her turn, subservient to his private and personal views, and showed particular partiality for one, a fine young creature called Noura. He still persisted in refusing to give up the hostages, and at length a Spanish schooner, having all the external appearance of a slave vessel, ran into the bay where the Malta was lying, and soon afterwards a boat from her, having on board her captain, boarded the Malta, and some conversation took place between him and Captain Young, in the course of which the latter ordered Antonio Joe's wives upon deck, and they were minutely examined by the Spaniard, and Captain Young also pointed out the fineness of their limbs and proportions. The result was that they were put into the boat and conveyed on board the Spanish vessel. They all evinced the strongest reluctance to quit the Malta, and cried bitterly when Captain Young communicated to them that they must go. Some hours after, the Spaniard's boat came again on board the Malta, with the mate of the schooner, a man who could speak English fluently, and he brought with him 2 bags filled with dollars. The dollars were counted, and the crew gathered from the conversation and from what they saw that there were $2 or $3 too many, which were given back to the mate. The following day the Spanish captain sent a present to Captain Young, who returned the compliment during the day by dispatching his own boat to the schooner, with a present for the Spaniard. Some of the Malta's boat's crew, when they got on board the schooner, said they had never overhauled a slave ship and should like to look at her. The mate took them below, and they saw there some 80 male blacks sitting chained between decks, which were so close to each other that the poor creatures had not room to sit upright. Upon the deck were crouched a great many women, and among the rest the 4 wives of Antonio Joe. They were not chained, but a man stood over them with a whip. Very soon after the Malta's boat left the schooner, the latter made all sail and stood out of the bay, and Captain Young was not long in following the example of the Spaniard, for he ordered the anchor to be weighed and stood to sea. In a few days the Malta was boarded at sea by His Majesty's sloop of war Raven, stationed to look after slave traders, and the mate of the Malta related to the officer what had occurred near St. John's, in consequence of which the Malta was detained and taken to Sierra Leone, where she, with the cargo, was condemned, and subsequently Captain Young, after being examined by the Judge Advocate of the colony, was put on board a transport and sent to England a prisoner, the crew being also sent as witnesses. On the arrival of the transport in the river, James John Smith, one of the principal officers of Bow Street, was sent down to take Captain Young into his custody. The officer took the captain to the victualling office at Deptford. In his defence, Captain Young denied the charge, which he declared was fabricated against him by the crew, from feelings of malice, because they had quarrelled with him. Sir Richard Burney said it was his duty, upon the evidence which had been adduced, to commit Captain Young to prison to await his trial, and he was accordingly committed to the House of Correction for Middlesex. He will be tried at the Admiralty Sessions, which, you'll be pleased to hear, He duly was, and was found, wait for it, not guilty. Now, if you thought that account was pretty shocking, sadly it's nothing compared to this one, also found in the same paper. The slave trade. We are informed by a shipmaster who lately arrived here from Trinity, Martinique, that while he was at that port, a French slave ship arrived there after a long passage from Africa. The whole number of slaves when taken on board consisted of 300, but owing to shortness of provision and other circumstances incidental to the traffic, 100 had died before the vessel arrived. The remainder were purchased by the commandant of the port and sent to his plantations. Our informant saw these poor wretches on their march. They were entirely naked and so miserably weak and poor that it was with difficulty they could walk. Some of them were placed on mules. All their ribs and bones could be counted. On asking a Frenchman the cause of their frightful appearance, he received for answer, with a significant gesture, "Want for the stomach." In the evening of the day of their arrival, a gentleman visited the plantation and saw a few of them seated eating sugarcane. The rest were housed, with the exception of some who were burying one of their number, and though at some distance he heard the groans of the dying slave, who was partly covered with earth. With a continuous stream of reports like these appearing in the papers, and the resulting revulsion to the slave trade growing throughout the country, the abolitionists eventually won through, and through the tireless work of Wilberforce and the thousands of members of the Anti-Slavery Society, such as the group set up by the good ladies of Leicester, a law was passed in 1833. Slavery was to be totally abolished throughout Britain and its colonies. The slaves were free. Other countries followed suit, and the horrors of the African slave trade were gradually stamped out. Although it was not until the end of the American Civil War in 1865 that this dark chapter of history finally came to an end. Gonna trouble the water.